Welcome to In His Grip with Dr. Chuck F. Betters, produced by Marking Ministries. Each In His Grip message is designed to help turn your hearts toward Jesus and equip you to walk by faith. Let's join Dr. Betters in the sanctuary as he preaches the series, Myth of the Greener Grass.
Broach a subject that I've entitled simply The Greener Grass. The picture that I have in mind is that of a big, huge cow eating grass in a 50-acre parcel of ground. The grass is growing very high, it's very thick, and there's plenty of it. But there's a fence around the property. And the cow entitled to all of the eating privileges at any time he or she so chooses. And at any place along that 50 acres decides to go through the barbed wire on the other side of the fence and munch away at what appears to be the greener grass on the other side. I want to talk to you today about the sin of adultery. There is more than one form of adultery. For example, we have in the book of Hosea, which I would like you to turn to in your Old Testaments, we have a picture of adultery that really carries a lot of implications to it and a lot of ramifications for us. And I want you to turn to the 4th chapter of the book of Hosea. Hosea chapter 4, beginning with verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites. Because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. Now let's stop right there just for a moment. And let's speak of the home life of those who have walked through the despair of an adulterous relationship in your home. These verses are going to speak to your heart because they are going to tell you that God understands what you're going through. For see, the language he uses is the language of broken people, the language of a broken heart. Listen to the language. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. Now you might want to translate the words in the land to in the home. There is only cursing, lying, and murder, stealing, and adultery. Notice what sins he groups adultery with. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land mourns, and all who live in it waste away. Not just the adulterer, but the victim. The beast of the field and the birds of the air and the fish of the sea are dying. But let no man bring a charge. Let no man accuse another. For your people are like those who bring charges against the priest. You stumble day and night. And the prophets stumble with you. So I will destroy your mother. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also reject you as my priests. Because you have ignored the law of your God, I will also ignore your children. The more the priest increased, the more they sinned against me. They exchanged their glory for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. And it will be like people, like priests. I will punish both of them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They will eat but not have enough. They will engage in prostitution but not increase, because they have deserted the Lord to give themselves to prostitution, to old wine and new, which take away the understanding of my people. They consult a wooden idol and are answered by a stick of wood. A spirit of prostitution leads them astray. They are unfaithful to their God. They sacrifice on the mountaintops and burn offerings on the hills, under oak, poplar, and terebinth, where the shade is pleasant. Therefore, your daughters turn to prostitution, and your daughters-in-law to adultery. I will not punish your daughters when they turn to prostitution, nor your daughters-in-law when they commit adultery, because the men themselves consort with harlots and sacrifice with temple prostitutes. A people without understanding will come to ruin. Though you commit adultery, O Israel, let not Judah become guilty. Do not go to Gilgal. Do not go up to Beth-aven, and do not swear as surely as the Lord lives. The Israelites are stubborn, like a stubborn heifer. How then can the Lord pasture them like lambs in a meadow? Ephraim is joined to idols. Leave him alone. Even when their drinks are gone, they continue their prostitution. Their rulers dearly love shameful ways. A whirlwind will sweep them away, and their sacrifices will bring them shame. There is no sin judged by the Jews with more horror than the sin of adultery. And yet there is no sin more common than the sin of adultery. To the Jews of the Old Testament, they believed that there were three sins that simply there was no justification for them: idolatry, murder, and adultery. The Bible is filled with some very graphic language in Jeremiah 5 and Ezekiel 16 concerning the sin of adultery. It was considered a capital offense because it attacked society at its most primal point, its most basic unit. It hit the heart of any civilization that's worth anything, the heart of the family. And so the Jews considered death penalty to be the only thing sufficient for the sin of adultery. Death by strangling. If you were a virgin engaged to be married to a man, the death penalty was stoning. If you were the daughter of a priest, the death penalty was burning. But the death penalty was rarely carried out because the sin was so common, as it is today. And so what the Jews did is they developed the doctrine of divorce. It is easier to divorce than to stone or burn or strangle someone. If a man divorced a woman for adultery, She forfeited the dowry. That is the money that was put up front by her parents in arranging the marriage. It was illegal for what we would call today live-in lovers to marry. They were considered unmarriageable because of their sin. The husband of an adulteress was required to divorce her. In fact, Numbers chapter 5 would make an interesting study for you on your own sometime, because in Numbers chapter 5, beginning with verse 11, there is a procedure for testing a suspected adulteress. It involved physiological responses and all sorts of technical things in order to figure out whether or not the adulteress was lying. Prostitution and religion in the religions surrounding Israel was commonplace. The cultic temples, for example, harlots and sodomites were commonplace. In Syria, the feast day of Atar was a day when all women voluntarily prostituted themselves to raise money for the temple. In Hierapolis, every maiden was required one time in her life to prostitute. In Byblos, the festival of Adonis, a fundraiser for the temple required one day of prostitution. In Paphos, before marriage, every woman had to prostitute herself. In Egypt, 1 month before marriage, every young girl had to walk around and act like a prostitute. When you look at the world in which the New Testament emerged, you have three cultures. You have the Greek culture, where the Greek view of woman was considered to be, she was a lower form of life. Intellectually and socially, she was considered inferior to her husband. She was incapable of taking any part in public life. Women were considered naturally prone to evil. They were fitted only to have babies and satisfy the sexual appetites of their husbands. And all of her life, she was considered to be legally a minor. In fact, in Greek society, a woman and an ox were classed together as necessary equipment. There was no formal education because she wasn't considered intellectually capable of developing intellectually and academically. As far as marriage was concerned, Greek marriages were arranged without any emotion by the guardian by way of a dowry. There was no heart for the marriage, no formal acceptance. It was stoic, non-love, if you will. Weddings in Greek culture formed in 5 stages, from offerings to the local gods to locks of golden hair, etc. In fact, there were ceremonial bathings, there were dedications to the river gods, there were offerings to the household gods, presentations of the wedding cake. All of those things were formed in the context of Greek culture, all through the Athenian priests. When it came to sex, when it came to faithfulness in marriage, and when it came to the issue of divorce in Greek society, it was a matter of course, they taught, for a husband to fulfill his lusts outside of marriage. He was expected to. He might turn to the temple prostitutes if she wasn't willing. He might turn to the brothels. Because you see, since the Greek wife could hardly be considered a partner to her husband, there was no stigma whatsoever to having sex outside of marriage. What was allowed for the husband was unthinkable for the wife. You get the picture? When it came to divorce, there were no legal processes necessary for a man to dismiss his wife. Divorce was compulsory for adultery and common if the woman could not conceive a child. Well, that's the Greek view. Now you have the Roman view. The Roman view of women was that a woman had a full share of life in the home and public life as well. She had full control of the slaves. She was the mistress of the home, and compared to the Greek woman, she was totally an emancipated or free woman. When it came to marriage in the Roman world, it was arranged by consent of the father, also including a dowry. It was solemnized, that's where we get our tradition from, by the giving of a gold ring. It was placed on the third finger of the left hand because they believed that that third finger represented the direct nerve that goes right to the heart. But the rights of the father that he had over his daughter were now passed to the husband. The patria potestas, or the power of the father, continued after marriage. When it came to sexual fidelity and divorce in the Roman world, divorce required a family council where the data or facts were seriously examined by all the members of the extended family. For the first 500 years of the Roman Empire, there was virtually no divorce. And it gradually decayed as the values of Rome decayed, as we see in Romans chapter 1, the picture of the world of the Romans at that time. And so you have the Greek view of marriage and divorce, the Roman view of marriage and divorce, and in the middle of that you have the Jewish view of womanhood and of marriage and of divorce. As early as 12 and a half, these girls were thoroughly domesticated. It's likely that the Virgin Mary was no more than 14 years old when she married Joseph. She had been fully prepared by her parents to raise children. It was profaning for a woman to carry some sort of posture outside of the home. And to profane or to hurt sexually a woman was considered to be a capital offense. They were exempt from the study of Jewish law. In fact, there's this old Jewish prayer. It says, although the rabbis viewed women as, quote, gluttonous, listeners at doors, lazy and jealous, quarrelsome and garrulous, their supreme influence in the home was never disputed. Even though they said all these things about her, she was considered the queen of the home. The great ideal of Proverbs 31, verses 10 through 31, those verses, by the way, which are captured by way of a system in which the girls were required to memorize what a virtuous woman looks like. Each of the verses begin with a subsequent letter of the Hebrew alphabet so that the girls could remember, here are the character qualities of a virtuous woman. It was memorized by a girl before she reached the age of 8. She knew inside and out what a virtuous woman is supposed to look like. But the interesting thing is, before the Sabbath day began, every man was required to read Proverbs 31. 10 through 31, concerning what constitutes a virtuous woman. It was considered her sacred obligation to marry. For one school or theological school of thought amongst the Jews, the Shammais, there were 2 sons. Hillel had 1 son and 1 daughter. Sinlessness was impossible. We all know that. They knew that individual women and individual men would sin, but it was considered a capital offense to sexually sin. Singleness was viewed as unwholeness, without life, without the blessing of God. They taught their girls and their boys that they had to marry young. You were considered old and over the hill if you were 18 and unmarried. After the age of 20, it was considered to be a sin to be single. A father at 19, a grandfather at 38, a great-grandfather at 57 was considered the ideal. And there was only one reason for a man or a woman to postpone marriage, and that was to study the law. And all marriages were arranged by the dowry. There was a consecration and a sanctification and a separation into marriage. There were high ideals that involved purity. that showed the evidence of the Shekinah glory. Honor the good man who loves his wife more than he loves himself. Considerateness was a proverb. If your wife is short, they said, bend down and whisper to her. Love was considered a central ingredient in every Jewish marriage. They would go through 3 stages. The engagement stage, kind of the matchmaker stage, the arranged marriage stage, the betrothal, which lasted about 1 year, binding legally, and then the marriage stage, or the wedding. Oftentimes their marriages would last, or their marriage ceremonies would last 2 or 3 weeks, where they would celebrate. Now, concerning sexual fidelity in marriage, divorce was compulsory. For 10 years of sterility, if she could not have a child in 10 years, divorce her. Or adultery, those were the grounds that were given. But then abuses started to develop. You read Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I'd like you to turn to that because it sets the stage for the rest of what I want to say. You have these 3 views. You have the Greek view, the low view of woman. You have the Roman view, which seemed to have a higher view of woman. And you have the Jewish view, which seemed to really cultivate the idea of a monogamous relationship. But they had a problem. If sterility was the mark of God's curse and having children was the mark of God's blessing, what do you do with a wife who can't conceive? What do you do in a marriage if you can't have children? Does that mean the curse of God is on you? And what do you do if your wife is unfaithful to you? If your spouse is unfaithful? And so schools of thought began to develop. Ideas and concepts about how divorce ought to replace stoning began to emerge. Deuteronomy chapter 24, beginning, with verse 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. Now underline that word indecent. Something indecent about her. And he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house. And if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. Now, quickly, the Jews of the New Testament era developed a division over what this passage means. The legalist went to one extreme, the formalist or the more liberal ones went to the other extreme, and you had 2 schools of thought emerge. You had one school that said the word indecent there means anything that the husband says is indecent. So if I don't like the way you look this morning, that's indecent, I can divorce you. If you burn my dinner, I can divorce you. If you are seen in public with someone and talking to someone, that's indecent. I consider it indecent. All I have to do is write a bill of divorcement, sign my name to it, take it down in front of a couple of elders who witness it, and you're put out. I keep your dowry, and you're gone. I get custody of the children, and you're gone. There were others who said that the word indecent means sexual infidelity. That is, some form of sexual impurity. That the only grounds for divorce was adultery. Now, these 2 schools were politically powerful schools in Jewish thought. One day, the Jews came to Jesus and confronted him with this situation. They said, when is it legal for a man to divorce his wife? For any cause? Now, if he answers it one way, he's going to offend one side. If he answers it the other way, he's going to offend the other side. He said to them, what did Moses write? And the passage in Deuteronomy 24 is cited. It speaks about the writing of a bill of divorcement. And they talked about that, and they debated about that back and forth. The point of the passage being that Jesus got to the point where he said to them, the only reason that passage is there is because of the sinfulness and hardness of your hearts. But from the beginning, it was not so. Why? Because God hates divorce. So what should you do if you're caught in a marriage in which your believing spouse, your Christian spouse, has committed adultery? You must go to him, and you must seek repentance. If that fails, you need to take 2 others with you. If that fails, you need to tell it to the church. I have told women again and again, I've told men, if you have followed the process of Matthew 18, you're in a Christian marriage, your husband claims to be a believer, and he or she will not repent of that sin, your only recourse left is to approach the spiritual leaders of the church and press charges against your adulterous husband or wife. Follow the process of Matthew 18. What do? We run to court. We protect ourselves with settlements. We get a slick lawyer. That's not the process believers are to follow. Not until all other processes have been followed. You need to come to the church and say, my husband, my wife refuses to repent of the sin of adultery. I need the help of the church.
Thank you for listening. For the complete sermon, please visit markinc.org and click In His Grip. Join Dr. Chuck F. Betters in the sanctuary from Monday to Thursday on the In His Grip podcast.